to be working and reading, researching for Pusako. It has been my privilege to research this topic on presidential term limits. It was specifically given to me to talk about presidential term limits from a United States perspective in order to offer what I know of my own country as a contrast to the discussion in Indonesia. I am a person who tends to view things in terms of world systems analysis, as well as the full historical context. So I never do approach a subject just in terms of what might be the case for it today. The matter for US presidential term limits in the present time is fairly straightforward in that we did firmly, after a longstanding custom, pass the 22nd constitutional amendment to the United States, which does limit it to a president being elected for 2 terms of 4 years only. There is some ambiguity in the language regarding non-consecutive terms, but it's been largely resolved at this point with the longest theoretical presidency a United States president could serve is 10 years, with that being the case if they were to ascend from the vice presidency to the presidency and then be elected twice, but only after an ascension with only 2 years remaining in the term. But the very notion of republicanism, which creates that situation, is a much older thing. It goes back to the beginning of Western and Eastern civilization itself, because everything is always a global project. Only 2 years remaining in the term. But the very notion of republicanism. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm hearing my own voice echoed back to me. That was disorienting. Okay, we stop. So, in the United States, the example of the American president, in addition to being a very practical and a very powerful role, is also almost elevated to the sense of a secular civic religion. The American president has a pseudo-legendary character, much like in the early Roman Republic, on which our government is based. The founding figures had a legendary status themselves. George Washington is, and has been compared before, as being equivalent to the Roman figure of Cincinnatus. Now, Cincinnatus was a Roman general and citizen who held the role of dictator on 2 occasions in the early history of the Roman Republic. That was a position of absolute power that happened after a condition of severe political turmoil concerning his son's opposition to an egalitarian movement, actually. But upon resolving the political issues with military and political force, for which he was called to be the dictator of Rome, Cincinnatus, after only a matter of 21 days, resigns the post of dictator. And this is not necessary for him to do constitutionally within the Roman system. He is in fact empowered absolutely. Technically, he should step down at some point, but there is no guarantee for that. A dictator could easily move to tyranny. But because of his voluntary dedication to the service of the state generally, he became an icon, a legendary figure of early Rome, and a model of this type of individual civic virtue, which becomes praised as a notion in both the Roman Republic and in the American Republic. There is a rising trend throughout the latter part of the second millennium, in which what they have figured out through the medieval period is starting to get integrated with classical revival, both because of the rediscovery of the Corpus Juris Civilis, and because of an increased interest as institutions start to collapse and crumble. Europe experiences an ice age from 1315 to 1815. Crop shortages start reducing the population. Disease ravages the population. The Protestant versus Catholic wars throw the entire place into turmoil. The universality of the Holy Roman Empire, of the Catholic Church, and the confidence in these institutions begins to crumble in a dramatic way, which turns people's attentions to classical sources. And in these classical sources, they find such thinkers as Aristotle and Epictetus, whose essential notion of citizenship in the political sense and personal virtue in both the moral, habitual, and even just aesthetic sense are perfectly integrated concepts. They all praise the notion of a man for the best qualities of men, which the word virtue is by itself just, it means men etymologically. He that is the most mannish is the greatest citizen. You'll find quotations on what they believe to be the greatest qualities of men, and they almost sound foreign to our ears. They say, this is a quotation from Aristotle here. He that claims less than he is deserved is small-souled. For the great-souled man is justified in despising other people. His estimates are correct, but most proud men have no good ground for their pride. It is also characteristic of the great-souled man never to ask for help from others, or only with reluctance, but to render aid willingly, and to be haughty towards men of position and fortune, but courteous towards those of moderate station. He must be open both in love and in hate, since concealment shows timidity, and care more for the truth for what people will think, and speak and act openly. Since as he despises other men, he is outspoken and frank, except when speaking with ironical self-deprecation as he does to common people. He does not bear a grudge, for it is not a mark of greatness of soul to recall things against people, especially the wrongs they have done you, but rather to overlook them. Such then, being the great solid man, the corresponding character on the side of deficiency is the small solid man, and on that of excess, the vain man. It's interesting, Aristotle goes on to describe the great solid man as a man with a slow step and a deep voice. These qualities matter to them in a moral sense. You could almost say, as they are developing the earliest part of civilization, they wish to constitute themselves in more detail. This notion becomes very influential in the American thinkers who are coming out of the English Civil Wars, who are starting to have a great distrust in Christian institutions, in the institution of the English monarchy. And they look to the Roman republics and they do a great, you could almost say, comparative analysis of the governments of the ancient world. Of course, this isn't perfect comparatism like in the later scholarly sense, because they lack reliable sources, such as is the case with all ancient scholarly research. But it was also already a burgeoning notion in English society, the concept of a great solid man in terms of their landed gentry. And this is consistent with Aristotle's notion of citizenship. And this is an important distinction here. In the current American Republic, in the current Indonesian Republic, in the current society generally, when we think of a democratic society, we think of a vote being something every citizen is entitled to, and in the most egalitarian, the most basically fair, the most reasonable construction of that concept, just about anyone of reasonable age and capacity, regardless of status or group, is a citizen. But the governments that the American founders are referencing did not have such a system. Essentially, the state was made up of houses, or gens in the Roman sense. But first, a man is self-sufficient. If he is self-sufficient and he has property and he has slaves in the Roman sense, then his household is a political unit. The patrician of that house, the paterfamilias, alone is a citizen, votes on behalf of all servants, subordinates, slaves within that house. All of their concerns are assumed to be subsumed into him, because only he who is an independent unit, capable of self-reliance, is a unit with the capacity to act within the state. The English conception of this gets more and more similar. Ever since they rediscover the corpus juris civilis, they start merging two different exemplar concepts of property. There is, in the Roman Republic, the exemplar concept of property concepts of what is fair about ownership is slavery. Whereas in the medieval period, it is landed property, real estate. And when they rediscover the corpus juris civilis, they start interpreting Roman law, interpreting it to be a law which is universal to Christians, because their concept of statecraft is highly distinct before the Westphalian period. And when these concepts become merged, this is where you get the system of feudal land tenancy, where a person is both in relation to that on whom he is dependent and also tied to the land he owns. This fused exemplar model creates systems where a person owns property based on their type of service to the monarch. They can have a Franco moinage, be a priest and keep their land in reference to their service of being a civil cleric. They can keep their land in a form of military service to the king, or they can pay quit rent and merely offer money. And all of these take the res of both the public land, the public sentiment, the public doings, and essentially pass the buck up to the crown in now the feudal system. They say that the king alone is the one who has dominion, property over all lands which are within the state. All others, because they are not independent of him, owe him some service. As they're starting to question this model, and as they're starting to develop a culture based on great houses, in which the leader of a great household who owns a great deal of land does have a certain sort of social, gentlemanly responsibility to the rest of civilization, to the crown itself, they come up with a uniquely 18th century social concept of something equivalent to the great, solid, or virtuous man, in which the notion of an English and then later American gentleman is similarly, like the great, solid man, a very specific concept of virtue, which etymologically meaning man again is circular. They're saying, well, a great man, he is virtuous, he is like a man. But such is often the case when we start to examine things at sufficiently close resolution. And it is this concept of gentlemanliness which is intrinsic to how the founding fathers saw American agrarian republic. They modeled it after thoughts they heard in the Florentine Republic, such writers as Niccolo Machiavelli. They modeled it after some of the thoughts of the levelers, some of the dissent that had gone on during the English Civil War. And as well on direct review of ancient Roman and Greek sources. And here, in this concept of a gentleman, a man who is refined, who has a sense of civic duty, being any one given citizen, who is independent, self-sufficient, owns his own land, is the commander of his house. This is the unit of person who can vote, who has political agency, who is a citizen. And in the beginning of the American Republic, this is essentially exactly the same as it was in the Roman Republic. Only the land-holding people who could be said to be self-sufficient by that criteria, can vote. And they are expected by that responsibility to have a corollary sense of duty to this notion of republic. And this becomes exceedingly important because the great influence of the American Constitution at least lets us know that we cannot forget this notion when revising constitutions again. We can set it aside, deconstruct it, dismiss it, get rid of it for the contemporary period. But we can't forget that there is this element that the entire premise of American republicanism, such as the framers cognized it from Roman republicanism, is that it is a government that will be successful only with the virtue of every individual citizen, who, being called by his moral obligations to the state to civic duty, is also called to public service, such as in the office of the president. And so this is why in the debates which lead up to the creation of the United States Constitution, there is a great deal of uncertainty over the nature of the office of the president. The office of the president is actually unique to the American Constitution. Well, not not unique now, originally unique to the American Constitution. It is the first time that term is ever used to denote a head of state, is in the creation of the United States Constitution, Article 2. Before that, the term from the Latin presidens is found in other sources, is used to refer to other offices even within the American colonies, but this is never before the notion of a head of state and head of government. And when a gentleman, a great solid man, a man of mannishness, of virtue, is called upon to the office of the president, he should model the example of Cincinnatus. He should not model the example of Caesar. And this is a great thing they fear. In the struggles of the Europe that is dealing with the Catholic and Protestant conflict, that is dealing with the Black Death, with the crop shortages, with the internecine conflict of the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War, and these things which lead to the Peace of Westphalia, which is said to create the current political structure, the current nation state, at least ideologically, conceptually. They see literally the ruins of the Roman Empire around them. And this remains true to this day, that Roman structures were built long enough to endure to the present, but not so was the virtue of mankind, because the Roman Empire falls at a certain point. Recent scholarship has very astutely said that it is not quite accurate to say that the Roman Republic, that the Roman Empire falls at so specific a time. But there was a very influential work in the 18th century by a fellow named Edward Gibbon about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And he is echoing an enduring sentiment that they are in a civilization post a collapse. And in the history of the Roman Empire, you have its early republic with its many virtues, and the Roman Empire, which is also considered great, except that at the moment of its creation, you can only have an unvirtuous act, which is Caesar crossing the Rubicon, taking the role of dictator, turning it into a formal and permanent office. Although Augustus was considered a great man, he still begins a society which is no longer a republic. And if we wish for the preservation of the republic, then we must prevent the temptations to cross the Rubicon, to use a standing military as a force against the people and Senate of Rome, as against the legislative and democratically elected body, by that concept of democracy over ours. And in creating the American Republic in this fashion, they make every detail of our Constitution about what would be likely to have influence upon the virtues of men. So, for instance, and this is an important distinction between the United States and the Indonesian Constitution. Our president, as I'm sure you know, is only in concept elected by direct democracy. We have such an election. The way the regulations are now, it is likely to direct democracy, but we have this electoral college. The electoral college, at this point in time, we still technically vote for electors who, on our behalf, based on the percentages of how we voted in each state under the Confederation, vote for the president by majority vote of their region, rather than the national vote simply going directly to the election of the president. And a lot of people are now finding this system fairly redundant, fairly nonsensical, and likely to produce unfair results, because sometimes you might win the electoral college without having won the popular vote, as happened in the 2000 election. And what they have forgotten in the popular discussion within the American media is that the electoral college served a purpose to preserve the gentlemanly and virtuous character of the people who would constitute the republic. So it is actually written explicitly in the early documents of our fathers, of our founding fathers, in the Federalist Papers, that and other documents concerning the debates around the formation of the Constitution, that the Electoral College is created in mind of permitting a politically disinterested and yet landed and educated class of people, the electors, who originally are not done as they are now, but originally just sent forth by whatever means each individual state wishes. The electors are actually meant to be able to overturn the decision of the electorate. They believe that even a republic constituted of citizens who were patricians over their own land, being landed and virtuous and great solid gentlemen, might still make irresponsible choices as to the administration of the republic. And so the Electoral College is originally meant to have the power to overturn that decision, to choose a responsible citizen, a responsible Cincinnatus. And specifically, the system of having an electoral college in each of the states, as opposed to a single federal college, was created in mind of denying the American people a single physical location, as in a single physical building, to bring violent redress, arms against the Electoral College, in case the Electoral College were to overturn their decision for the election of president, and they became so enraged that they wished to bring violent revolution, which, of course, to the framers of the U.S. Constitution, this is not a very far-off concept, having only a few years before won their own revolution. And yet wishing to thwart it, such a revolution again, under their own learned notions, they create the Electoral College. Now, this concept has been lost in the history of the American Republic. It is now illegal for an elector of the Electoral College to vote differently than the popular vote in the region they're representing. And this can still be violated. The elector has the ability to vote contrarily, but they are fined and it's considered illegal. And it's very rare, never happens. This is no longer how we think about it in the contemporary period, of course. We think not so much about the virtues and characters of men. People are not, in this secular age, extremely concerned with the moral constitution of an individual. But one of the archetypes of the American gentleman, the American citizen, the American Roman citizen, so to speak, is George Washington himself. We use him as an example of how every U.S. citizen should behave. As a boy myself, even in this late era, I was taught many things about the legacy of George Washington in our public schools. I was told to emulate him. I was told apocryphal stories, as in completely fictional stories about his virtues. Well, I only learned later in college that many of these stories were false. And the image of this is taken by authors like Washington Irving, who we further go on to create illustrious narratives of the virtues of these men. And although their accounts are necessarily exaggerated, and which the common American citizen no longer places very much credit in, they are almost a natural product of the concept of creating a republic of virtuous, landed gentlemen. There was a 19th century Irish newspaper journalist. He came to the United States and actually supported the Confederate States of America during the Civil War, having to leave from New York City as a result of that position. And he felt that this notion was also intrinsic in our problem of having slavery, that the notion of Roman agrarian republic necessarily required the slavery which accompanied it in its historical example. By the Union victory in the Civil War, we hopefully go against that, but the legacy is important to recall. Now, George Washington, when he had his terms in office, it was actually discussed in the constitutional debates, which occurred during the ratification of the United States Constitution, that George Washington would be the most likely person to be elected as the first president. During debates in the Constitution, it is not at all clear how long it is realistic for a president to serve. They do not put any formal term limit in the United States Constitution, although there are some arguments and complaints that there ought to be, that perhaps he should only be electable once, perhaps that there should not be a president, perhaps that the president should be an executive council or a triumvirate instead. But they at least ultimately come to the model of having a president, of having a president with a 4-year term, and of that term, that he is re-eligible for election, but no restriction is placed on how many times he may do so. And George Washington himself, upon being elected initially or during his campaign, he is of the opinion that he is not even going to serve one full 4-year term. And I find that important to note because even his own expectations are modified. Because considering it necessary for the health of the republic for him to continue, he does serve his entire 4-year term, contrarily to his initial promise, and runs for re-election, contrarily to his initial promise. But in 1796, upon the concept and the general assent, the general sentiment of most American citizens at this time, who, mind you, again, are mostly landed gentry, that he ought to run for a 3rd term and that he ought to continue doing so for the rest of his natural life. Him being such a virtuous character as was competently managing the administration of the republic already, and as the conflicts of the republic are starting to become more internecine, more uncertain, they're like, we need a stable administration. We need you to stay. Great, Washington. And he returns with an address which is published in a newspaper and largely written by Alexander Hamilton, who personally does not actually support term limits for the president, but wrote it on behalf of George Washington. I'd like to read a section of it now. From September 17th, 1796, from George Washington's farewell address. Friends and fellow citizens, the period for a new election of a citizen to administer the executive government of the United States being not far distant, and the time actually arrived when your thoughts must be employed in designating the person who is to be clothed with that important trust, it appears to me proper, especially as it may conduce to a more distinct expression of the public voice, that I should now appraise you of the resolution I have formed to decline being considered among the number of those out of whom a choice is to be made. I beg you at the same time to do me the justice to be assured that this resolution has not been taken without a strict regard to all the considerations appertaining to the relation which binds a dutiful citizen to his country, and that in withdrawing the tender of service, which silence in my situation might imply, I am influenced by no diminution of zeal for your future interest, no deficiency of grateful respect for your past kindness, but am supported by a full conviction that the step is compatible with both the acceptance of and continuance hitherto in the office to which your suffrages have twice called me have been a uniform sacrifice of inclination to the opinion of duty and to a deference for what appeared to be your desire. I constantly hoped that it would have been much earlier in my power, consistently with motives which I was not at liberty to disregard, to return to that retirement from which I had been reluctantly drawn. The strength of my inclination to do this previous to the last election had even led to the preparation of an address to declare it to you. But mature reflection on the then perplexed and critical posture of our affairs with foreign nations and the unanimous advice of persons entitled to my confidence impelled me to abandon the idea. I rejoice that the state of your concerns, external as well as internal, no longer renders the pursuit of inclination incompatible with a sentiment of duty or propriety, and am persuaded, whatever partiality may be retained for my services, that in the present circumstances of our country, you will not disapprove my determination to retire. And the remarkable part of Washington's resignation here is that he does so against great popular sentiment that he should not. And this act puts him as a literary figure in the same regard as Cincinnatus, someone who is known for the volitional termination of power. After this, it becomes convention, just custom in the United States by no formal regulation, that a president resigns after 2 terms. Merely after the model of Washington. We do this until literally 1950, when the 22nd Amendment is passed. For most of the history of the Republic, there is no formal restriction. And until the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we have no president who serves more than twice. But yes, the problem with the custom and the problem with the dependence on the notion of the virtue of the citizenry is that people tend to forget the causes for custom. People's notions cognitively change as the progress of civilization on goes. And so there have been numerous presidents who have either in the history of the United States prior to the 22nd Amendment expressed interest and attempted to seek the nomination of his party for a 3rd term, or in fact run a campaign to be elected for a 3rd term, culminating in Teddy Roosevelt running for a 3rd term actually under a 3rd party, thwarting the party from which he had come originally, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt running for a 3rd and 4th time and in fact succeeding, holding that office. It was after this that it felt that the custom was insufficient and that a limit had to be imposed. But the notion of the virtuous citizen who would volitionally give up power regardless of whether or not there was a formal restriction is important to recall, because it is intrinsic in the notion of civic American duty, such as it is inculcated to people of this republic. And that is why, even where a president wishes to serve for a third term, as some presidents have expressed and attempted to do so, generally this is met by the American people with hostility as a general sentiment. There is a poem that was written on the ascension of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte by the poet Byron. He actually compares him against Washington because there is a directly contrary example. The person who had access to the great powers of republic and of state and relinquished them, versus Napoleon Bonaparte, who assumes the role of emperor in order to guarantee the revolution. So he says. But although he had great popularity at the time, there were those commentators who saw very clearly, including Byron, who wrote thusly: "But thou, forsooth, must be a king, and don the purple vest, as if that foolish robe could wring remembrance from thy breast. Where is that faded garment, where the gewgaws thou wert fond to wear, the star, the string, the crest? Vain froward child of empire, say, are all thy playthings snatched away? Where may the wearied eye repose when gazing on the great, where neither guilty glory glows, nor despicable state? Yes, one, the first, the last, the best, the Cincinnatus of the West, whom envy dared not hate, bequeathed the name of Washington. To make man blush, there was but one." And here Byron decries Napoleon for not going after Cincinnatus's and Washington's example. But it is a fascinating contrast to that notion that we now live in a substantially different republic in the United States than that. In that time, we no longer have such a notion of citizenship as creates the virtues intrinsic in the president after that model. We scarcely remember the origins of things about the early republic, such as the Electoral College and its motivations. And now, roughly any person who turns 18 has the right to vote, which I myself consider to be a positive development. But it is an incongruity. It does present a contradiction between the cognitive purposes of a republic like this one, which then became the model of so many other republics throughout the world, to have direct democracy in the manner it now does. And on this point, I wanted to read a bit from Benjamin Franklin, who gives a speech at the end of the Constitutional Conference. This is the last address that Benjamin Franklin, one of our great founding fathers, addresses to the Constitutional Convention at the conclusion of its debate as to why he assents to the passage of the Constitution, because it remains an important point. "In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution, with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us. And there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And I believe far that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years, and can only end in despotism as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. I doubt too whether any convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly, can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. And I think it will astonish our enemies, who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are confounded like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation, only to meet hereafter the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best." He goes on for some time, but the point I wanted to extract from that is his notion that no form of government would be faulty in and of itself, in a citizenry that is sufficiently virtuous to require that it be well administered. And in so arranging it, they hope to create a constitution, a republic, whose basic forms and methods of relation to one another create virtuous people in the sense of citizens, citizens of landed gentry, who then serve in public offices such as the president. But he notes that it is not possible for this public to subsist unless personal virtue be one of the aims of every citizen within that republic, or at least a good majority of them. And that doesn't comport exceptionally well to systems of contemporary governance, where the pace, the amount of people, the amount of economic policies and concerns which appertain to the role of a president, the role of a federal administrative body in any contemporary state, these things move at far too quick a pace for us to think in terms of concepts like ancient Grecian and Roman virtue. We make decisions as they're needed on a moment-by-moment basis. But it is the notion of that virtue which caused the American Republic not to have presidential term limits at its outset. And it was the first violation of that custom which caused us to formally pass the 22nd Amendment and require that, because it became clear enough to us that the notions of the virtue of statesmen had substantially changed from the early Republic, at least sufficiently so, that we could not depend on the virtues of men in order to have the matter settled, and so instituted formal term limits, about which the matter is fairly legally settled. Man may have 2 terms there, or man or woman. There is no mitigation of that. No great constitutional challenge has ever been brought on that point. But the degradation of those norms of virtue is starting to erode the confidence in U.S. institutions. We just had the presidency of Donald Trump, who, without saying any political commentary in one direction or another, one thing that can be said without personal political interest is that he was most famous for his abrogation and his non-comportment with the norms of civic virtue that are expected of U.S. presidents. And some people consider this a good thing, those who vote for him, and others are quite disturbed. Some who vote for him are quite disturbed by that point, wish that he would comport with the notion of a gentleman in the Roman and American sense. And if you lack such a unifying concept as the American people had, they have this image of Cincinnatus, of Washington, of Benjamin Franklin, of great men of virtue, after which they model themselves. And it's not necessarily recommendable that we do, because public confidence in these institutions is eroding. Public confidence in the historical records of these people is eroding. But it was at least sufficient for enough of American history that great industrial and commercial progress was made and caused us to have a sufficiently powerfully strong central government that we've had the global influence that we've had. But without such an image of the virtuous citizen, you then have a notion of presidential republic modeled after the American notion, or the American notion, this present American republic such as we have is an instantiation of the present, of the prior American notion, just as other states that have modeled themselves on it are separate instantiations. We are disconnected from the cognitive structure of that state and merely use its forms as a vestigial point. But we can remember from that contradiction that we no longer have, and perhaps for excellent reason, don't prefer the notion of a republic that structures are merely dependent on a belief in the virtues of men to carry on society. That notion being intrinsic in republic, and that notion of citizenship being abrogated. So now that most people are citizens who reside in a place, each of those people have as much responsibility, at least such as it's presently constituted, to their federations respectively, to their constitutions respectively, as ancient notions of civic virtue would expect of them. The Florentine Republic from which Niccolo Machiavelli gives us the contemporary political state, still collapses under external political influences, under internal political influences. And these writers were sure, as were the American founders, that political entities decay over time from internal corruption, from the vices of people, but that they are maintained through the virtues of people. And that is about the summary of my thoughts on them. That at least so long as we have presidential republics modeled after the American system, we have such systems of government as assumed that any given citizen, who is now far more people than it ever was, and then by the increase of the global population, far more people than have ever been. We are now in a kind of unstable and a kind of absurd conflict. And you can, if you agree with the thoughts of many of the early framers that there should not be term limits, try to encourage a kind of public civic virtue, a kind of virtue in a president, and say that that is perhaps sufficient. And perhaps if things incidentally go so well, if the character of the people are sufficiently so cooperative, if the interest in the common weal is sufficiently so good, it might work out that way. But the contemporary pace of things and of policy has generally seemed to recommend formal rules such as the 22nd Amendment of the United States Constitution, saying that it is preferable if a man does not serve more than 2 terms, man or woman. Now, because otherwise, something like the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt can happen again. Trump was a similar case. Both of them were like cults of personality, just as Theodore Roosevelt had been before him. And the policies that Franklin Delano Roosevelt established are now considered almost integral to the civic fabric of the United States, impossible to abrogate. It creates stagnation because it does increase the efficacy of an administration to go on for longer. And that increases public confidence in that administration. But the effect towards the consolidation of tyranny and the effect towards the stagnation of those notions can be quite destructive. Whether or not there is a decisive answer on whether or not that should be permitted to go on or whether limitations should be put instead can only be answered by future history. And I'll end here with a quote from Alexander Hamilton, who wrote the earlier address by Washington. This comes from his notion, his Federalist paper number 71. And it pertains to his belief that there should not be term limits. Now, this is written before he works on Washington's address. And I leave this just to give a counterpoint to the historical narrative that has established itself so far. I mean, being a historic narrative of the American Republic, that is one which ends in someone believing in the virtue of term limits. But just to leave the contrasting view for the sake of interest, Hamilton writes this as the Constitution is still being debated and ratified. As to the second supposed advantage, there is still greater reason to entertain doubts concerning it. If the exclusion, that is, of a person from the election to office, were to be perpetual, a man of irregular ambition, of whom alone there could be reason in any case to entertain apprehension, would, with infinite reluctance, yield to the necessity of taking his leave forever of a post in which his passion for power and preeminence had acquired the force of habit. And if he had been fortunate or adroit enough to conciliate the goodwill of the people, he might induce them to consider as a very odious and unjustifiable restraint upon themselves a provision which was calculated to debar them of the right of giving a fresh proof of their attachment to a favorite. There may be conceived circumstances in which this disgust of the people, seconding the thwarted ambition of such a favorite, might occasion greater danger to liberty than could ever reasonably be dreaded from the possibility of a perpetuation in office by the voluntary suffrages of the community exercising a constitutional privilege. There is an excess of refinement in the idea of disabling the people to continue in office men who had entitled themselves, in their opinion, to approbation and confidence, the advantages of which are at best speculative and equivocal and are overbalanced by disadvantages far more certain and decisive. And it's interesting to note there that a constitution is, of course, evidence of a constitution. A contract is evidence of an agreement. Whether or not that document is especially effective in constituting the republic which it creates remains to be seen throughout the following history. The thoughts of the framers concerning the motivations for the office of president, his term limits or not, were mostly created by collective compromise, being represented hundreds of men of many views. And the republic we now have is almost unrecognizable to the one they initially created. So we are, to some extent, dependent on our cognitive freedom to perceive and think well on these ideas, regardless of what our constitutions respectively individually say. And so we return again to the notion that a government requires the moral behavior of not only its citizens, but also its citizens in public service. And the best we can perhaps do to create sufficiently productive cognitive environments for the people to think well, to feel confidence in their public institutions, to not be subject to the powers of perhaps a tyrant who would want to stay in office for a very long time, is perhaps to create such a limitation. And yet, one could say that so long as the people are willing to re-elect a fellow, that there is no reason to prevent that outcome. I'd probably be in the former camp. I would go with George Washington himself rather than with Alexander Hamilton and say that there is a certain expeditious benefit to presidential term limits, as my republic has generally agreed in its history, and especially with the passage of the 22nd Amendment. And with that, that will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. So I believe we're now moving on to questions. Should there be a particular procedure for that, or should I just start reading on the side?
Just read in the chat box. If there is a question, just answer. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so I'll go start scrolling through the chat box here. Question from a student. Why the executive power should be limited, as in America, to term, as you mentioned, while the judicial power tenure is regulated differently? That's a good question. So yes, the judicial power is given Bene Gesserit, or Latin for good behavior. And the reasons that the framers give for that is the notion that a judge in particular is supposed to exist separately from temporary political motivations. And this goes back again to the notion that they all had of the virtues that were necessary of learned gentlemen and landed gentry to run a state and to run their own households. They think that in common political discussion, things get out of hand, they get heated in the temptations of a moment, and that if you're really going to constitute the republic around men that you want to be virtuous by establishing the habits that the Constitution recommends to them, you want people who are going to expound the Constitution itself not to be persuaded by these quick, in the moment, heated discussions. But there's certainly no guarantee that they were correct about that point. It has been observed many times in the history of the United States Supreme Court that its motivations have been political, have been inspired by the heats of the moment. Some of the issues concerning the fellow Merrick Garland, they wouldn't appoint to the Supreme Court because Barack Obama was reaching the end of his term limits. And the number of people that were elected by Trump as a result of the strategy employed by the Senator Mitch McConnell to prevent Supreme Court justices from being appointed due to a temporary political motivation. And now a lot of people feel frustrated that inconsistently with the customary norms they would expect, the Supreme Court is no longer constituted in a way that is consistent with the democratic history of the time in which they were appointed. So in spite of the intent that the judge needs this objectivity that is free from it hasn't necessarily worked out that way. And so that notion could use some criticism. And in fact, the United States Constitution does permit a judge to be impeached and convicted and removed from office of the Supreme Court. But so far, this has never been done. There was an impeachment of a federal officer I mean, there have been impeachments of federal judges, but never of the Supreme Court. So perhaps as norms start to evolve in the United States, we might start invoking the impeachment of Supreme Court justices, or perhaps a constitutional amendment might change that particular requirement as people become frustrated with the heavily partisan court we now have. That's the question. 2 says, according to you, how long the ideal president tenure for the best democratic state? Well, yeah, as I was saying towards kind of the end of my presentation, that's kind of up in the air. The one we have seems to have worked out fairly well, at least in terms of having a strong central confederated republic that at least has not collapsed under any pressures that have pertained to the dictatorial authority of a president. But perhaps recent events have called that into question. So, I mean, 8 to 10 years does seem to be working, at least by the historical example. But for instance, I mean, the Florentine republics that I mentioned before, while it was not preferable that they fell and were replaced by hereditary monarchical forces such as the, I believe it was the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, which becomes what was the Federal Republic. The Medicis, who then rule as hereditary ducal monarchs over that place that had been a republic, still performed very well. They all serve life tenures. They yet nevertheless bring great commercial success, prestige, prosperity to the what had been the Florentine Republic. Not something I recommend. I don't recommend replacing democratic officials with hereditary monarchs, but again, it's highly dependent on specific situations. What is an ideal tenure? Question 3. Then how do I see the idea of limitation of the presidential term vis-a-vis the democracy concept? Known that democracy is the concept of the people's sovereignty, so the people's intention is the power. What if after 2 terms the people still want the president to take office and run for again? This is also a good question. Yes, the notion of republic always has this intrinsic conflict between the desire to see a state run by a democratic impulse versus the counter-majoritarian difficulty of having norms and constitutional standards of which it should not be in violation. So, I mean, this is a commonly discussed tension, the tyranny of the majority versus the forms of the state. But yes, I mean, the temporal power of the state is sufficient that should it be made the law by the popular assent and be made a constitutional law, as it previously was in the Indonesian constitution, that there is now a 2-term limit. There is sufficient respect for that temporal power of the state to say that we have been bound by a previous iteration of our people, and perhaps the persuasion of this present moment, when a 3rd term for this president is calling to us, is a heat that we should resist because of the wisdoms of our forebears who have created this republic, this constitution. And that is one thing from which the American Republic has traditionally benefited, probably less and less in recent history, but traditionally American citizens throughout most of its history, aside from certain dissenters, abolitionists, people like William Lloyd Garrison, they have traditionally felt that the notion of the American Republic and the Constitution which created it was a very good one, that the framers were excellent, virtuous, learned gentlemen. They have confidence in the institutions that were set forth. So although it sometimes created results which were contrary to their passing and temporary fancies, they at least trusted the system to carry on that way as intended, or at least as they thought it had been intended. Now, of course, that's only as good as the public confidence in that institution remains. So you have your previous amendment instituting term limits for the Indonesian president. Of course, this is only as permanent a concept as it can be retained in the Constitution before another event would cause it to be amended and include a 3rd or possibly more presidential terms again. The common assent to the rightness of the notion of presidential term limits is required to be maintained. I mean, in order to actually make the argument of a constitution, to actually constitute, to put all these concepts that are put down in the document of a constitution and set them in motion to create a republic in practice. Public confidence in those institutions is required. The people, the ones who are sufficiently capable of political action and involvement and intervention that they are present when you are trying to form a constitution, they must necessarily believe that the project on which they are endeavoring is a good one. Otherwise, right, you can have any number of provisions in the Constitution that'll be expressly ignored. And some aspects of that are even true in the United States Constitution, like, for instance, the United States Constitution, in fear of someone like Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, taking military control over a democratic republic, forbids us to have a perpetually standing army and prefers a militia system of volunteers. But in practice, this is never observed anymore. Public confidence in that notion is low. We believe that a standing army is necessary for threats, foreign and domestic, and don't seem to care that it's technically illegal. So it is a counter-majoritarian, counter-democratic difficulty to have a Republican constitution rather than to have pure and direct democracy on every point. But the good sense of that notion is essential. And let's see. And those seem to be the three questions in the chat. Were there any more questions?
Okay, thank you so much for the fruitful discussion and the presentations. Stephen, maybe another member of Pusako still have a question. If yes, you can ask Stephen directly. Isan or Bang Isan Kabula, do you have any questions regarding this topic?
Me.
Hello. Ya, silakan Pak Charles.
Yeah, thank
Isan.
you, Stephen. Based on your explanation, today in some democratic countries have a new trend, like Russian, Philippine, Turkey, maybe, all or some presidential countries about term of presidential period. Like in my Indonesia, my country, today, some politicians have idea to change our constitution to menambah itu apa?
To add, yeah.
To fit, yeah.
To add.
Add a new norm in our constitution to give a term of presidential period to be 3 or more than 2, and like Philippine 2 and a Russian presidential term, they try to change the constitution to give more term to the president, and I think but in the country, some people think it's okay because based on the experience them with the president, and they think the president give them what we said social goods and welfare to them. And how about this? How about your opinion with this phenomena? And I think you read some another country to have like Indonesian idea today. Thank you. Ari, can you explain?
Can you understand the question, Stephen?
Do you understand?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe so. You were saying that on the discussion of the amendments to the Indonesian Constitution, that they're discussing possibly adding a third term for the office of the president, and that this would be acceptable because the president's, if the people assent to this, then the president's successful administration brings political benefits through his increased efficiency. essentially.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
I give some countries for the example in Philippines and Russian and Turkish too.
Yes, and
Most of the presidential system.
yeah, that's an excellent point. There's also a good book that came out recently called "The Rise and Fall of Arab Presidents for Life," which pertains to an increasing, well, what was at the time of its composition, an increasing trend of presidential republics in Arab countries, just not having any essential end to their terms. People such as Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad himself, descended from his father's life presidency. The several other Mubarak, etc. These people who might very well have been interested in creating dynastic presidencies, which was a temptation that was present at the creation of the American Republic. There was a letter written to George Washington in 1783, essentially arguing to him that we should establish a monarchy in the United States, and that he would be well received as his first king. He writes back that he could not have found, the author of the letter could not have found an individual other than Washington to whom that notion was more disagreeable. But yes, there is a sort of breakdown that's going on in these notions of government. And I won't say it's not an unstable situation that could cause new questions for what we want out of nation states, what we are doing in the project of a republic. Because from the time of the Peace of Westphalia, when we get what is now the contemporary nation state, to the excesses of the colonial project, which creates a joint story of which we are both members. You living in the East Indies, I living in the West Indies. This system is breaking down when it tries to replicate its republican systems in places that did not ontologically, because it was not of their own political will, create that system necessarily entirely voluntarily. And so, or if they're poorly adopted, or adopted to specific cultural notions, as is sometimes speculated to be the case with Russia. But it seems to be the case that there is a shelf life on the way the post-colonial states have been instantiating themselves. And the strong central figure of the president does seem to be one of the complicating factors. It was debated at the U.S. constitutional ratification debates in both the federal Congress under the Articles of Confederation and the states individually, that perhaps such a figure did have too much power. But the Federalist Party was more successful in prevailing the idea that you needed a unified, singular executive in order to have sufficient energy to manage such an administration as was to be the strong central civic government of the Federated Republic. But that was after a process of specific and collective agreement and collective struggle. They had already fought their revolution. They had already created a first iteration of a republic that was unsuccessful, and were forming it themselves from their experience, from their learning, from their comparisons. When this notion was then forced on Arab societies following the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when the American Constitution became very influential in many different states, it seems that this notion, while influential enough and successful enough to have been so influential, to have created such global wealth and prosperity as is claimed to be, although there are moral criticisms as to the amount of global exploitation and colonial theft which has occurred of that wealth. Yet, it is not a truly universal answer for states everywhere. And it seemed to especially be the case in the Arab countries, and perhaps because of the imperial notions of statecraft, which left minority ethnicities in power in order to create a certain type of civic instability that would ensure imperial control over those places. That the singularity and unified sole executive was someone it was easy for corrupt forces in various presidential republics created around the world now today to conspire for the control of, to restrict to a fairly limited class, and to allow institutions to degrade. And one of the typical features, it seems, of this is that presidential tenures are extended indefinitely. Now, I don't know if that's universally the case, if that's necessarily always going to be the case, but the unwillingness to relinquish power, I think, is a cognitive error. And our governments are only as good as we're able to think about them, both as individual citizens and as public servants when we take up an office. Because there is an intrinsic tension just as the public might think, so the president himself might think, my terms are coming to an end. If I resign and do not run for re-election again and continue the administration, a new administration, a new president will come in. He will not have my experience. He will upset my offices. He will replace all of the people I have employed, who are now well experienced and well grooved into the administration of the state. And such concerns are pressing upon our government, as I cannot or should not responsibly set aside to the new administration. And it is true that if he were to remain in office instead, or she or they or whoever, then there would be an increase in efficiency, that there is an efficiency benefit for political goods, in fact, offered and made manifest to the people, that is lost when a president steps down. And that you can argue, if they democratically perpetuate instead, could be retained, except that so far in the history of the 20th century and in the particularly post-colonial, post-imperial context in which so many states have been wrought, which have been intrinsic with a certain kind of colonialism as a part of their establishment, that almost by design, if not by human frailty generally, the corruptions surrounding the model of a sole central executive are tempting, are likely, are a strong cognitive error. And both the people who would wish to have that president continue, as well as the president himself, should remember that the president will die. There's a phrase in the Roman Catholic Church, they say memento mori, or just remember that you will die. And this becomes a central concept of much of Christianity, that we arrange our lives knowing that we will die, and keeping that in mind. I mean, of course, the president who does not have term limits is still not immortal. And that efficiency drop-off of his transferring power is going to happen at some point. And if it's going to happen necessarily, I think it's most likely better to stick to a known standard of term limits that has been reliable in particularly the states which have unduly created their global influence by the colonial project. Those states have seemed to think that presidential term limits, prime ministerial term limits, if they have them, or extremely limited monarchies, if they still have those, things which keep the head of government and head of state at least freshly rotated on a fairly regular basis, seemingly no longer than a decade, seems to create a stable example of a state. Whereas the temptation to continue would seem to increase in both the people who are loyal to that president's administration and the president himself. The thought that, well, it would seem to lead to a sort of whirlwind, a small universe, something in high resolution, something especially sensitive to the passing moments of the politics of that time, instead of the overall health of a constitutional Republican government. When the fellow says the political needs of the moment, the political benefits I can give to the people right now, because of my competency, because of my administration, because of my continuity, because of my legacy, should be continued rather than the health of the republic maintained. This seems to produce bad results in both the minds of those men who continue in that office and in the way their administrations hold on to fairly limited, fairly stagnated governments in which similar individuals who do not have a freshness of perspective, who become accustomed to being in power, who become tempted by sins of the flesh, so to speak, of the fact that their office has certain prestige, has certain positions, it festers after a time, is my perspective. So I think even in the situation of Indonesia, where you might in fact have a president who is sufficiently virtuous, who perhaps would not fall to the temptations that one might be concerned with about corruption is nevertheless still only one figure in the government, perhaps the executive and a highly important one, but can't control everything that is attendant to the problems of remaining in office for so long. And also cannot predict how a third term will affect his own mind or her own mind. I think that's probably better to avoid. I think probably the immediate benefits should be guaranteed as well as they can be, but still deferred to the long-term interests of public confidence in the institutions of that government. If the people start to depend on the reliability of a certain figure as president, and don't depend on a knowledge of the stable and recurrent transitioning of power between multiple presidents, then their public confidence in the institutions of the Indonesian Republic is tied to the figure of that person who remains in office as president, more so than to the structure of the republic. And one thing the United States has often had, although not always, is peaceful transitions of power. With the custom George Washington sets in motion, there is, until the Civil War begins in 1860, never an interruption as to a president holding an administration relatively effectively and passing it on to someone else without the republic literally collapsing, without the people coming in the common weal, coming to great destruction. And the Civil War is the sole interruption in that, is decided quickly under a single president, in fact. And it was specifically the norms about the character of transitioning between presidents that our most recent president, Donald Trump, violated, that started to concern even some of his own supporters, because the American people are used to the peaceful transition of power. And there were some violent protesters who were in favor of the administration of Donald Trump. And it was asked of them by the media. They say, now, if these people create a problem for the peaceful transition of power, say you should lose the election, what will you do about it? And he was unwilling to say that I would tell them not to create such a protest, to not bring a non-peaceful transition of power, until eventually he was pressured enough that he did say that. And I think the confidence of the American Republic in the notion of the peaceful transition of power has been one of its strengths so far. And so that's why it's recommendable that even a good Indonesian president might even have a good third term, that the benefits of perpetual transition outweigh the benefits of immediate administrative efficiency. And it's specifically the loss of that when we had that protest on January 6th, when people literally stormed the Capitol of the American Republic over fear that the election was not being handled in a safe way, that people are starting to feel in my country that are like, what is happening to the Republic? Do we need very serious presidential amendments and things? And so yes, yeah, that would be my opinion. Is, even in spite of the increased administrative efficacy, it is important that public confidence in the institutions of the Republic is strong. And so it's important that they know that power can be transferred peacefully and effectively, and that it'll be okay, that the state's not going to collapse. There's not going to be major violence, uprisings, protests, upheaval, loss of access to services, food, power, etc. That the sun will rise again if simply someone else is elected president. That shouldn't be so big a deal. We shouldn't become so attached to one man who is, after all, or one woman, one person who is, after all, mortal, because that republic that had so much president can only last as long as that president can live. After that, it's whose republic is it? It's someone else's now. Now we have to figure out a new model for transitions of power, because we've had this person for so long that there will probably even be constitutional amendments because this person is done with their term. And it's, well, what is the confidence in that system that is held by the public? It's as temporal and ephemeral as the political moments which attended the transitions of power between long-serving presidents. So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer and response. Does anyone in this room still has the questions? If yes, you can ask Stephen directly, Bang Isan Kabullah, Isan Alia, and another participant, Benny and Kak Dita. If no, I think there is one last questions from me. Could you tell us why then the president tenure in US is 4 years? What is the legal reasoning or legal history of it? Because in Indonesia, the president tenure is 5 years for the twice. As you know, why there is an issue to check to do the constitutional change in Indonesia, because they think that 5 years is not enough to develop or increase the economic in Indonesia, because the first 5 years they have to dealing with the politics and to make the stable government, and then the second term 5 years is not enough to increase the economic and the development. So that's why they wanted to change they wanted to change the presidential tenure in Indonesia. My question is, why then the American Constitution just allocate 4 years for the president tenure? Why not 5 years, 7 years? That it is ideal and enough to build the legacy under his administration. Can you catch up with the? Okay.
Yes, I can. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, one thing to remember about the American Constitution is it is so old. It is, I mean, at this point, we are now one of the older states that have continuously existed on the earth. So the constitutional drafting process, which we had, is not up to contemporary snuff. If you were to, consult with the idea people, other comparative constitutional scholarly organizations such as yourself, on the process of drafting a new constitution, the standards you would tend to assume were not observed in the creation of the American Constitution. So you have a bunch of men that people have collectively agreed were learned and gentlemanly and up to certain standards of virtue, but that nobody in that House of Representative body thought to be the case, considering how much disdain they had for their fellow men. So there is not an excellent answer in terms of a contemporary constitutional process for the decision of 4 years. But upon your question, I was immediately reminded of this is directly commented on by Alexander Hamilton, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, which are considered one of the most important sources on the thinking that went into the ratification, composition, creation of the Constitution. This one is called Federalist number 70, and it's about the character of the executive. From the Federalist perspective, of course, not everything that Hamilton believed and wrote in the Federalist Papers became true of the Constitution. But he speaks here directly about the reasoning of 4 years. So I actually don't know a better way to answer your question, but to read him directly. So he writes in, actually, sorry, no, this is Federalist number 69. I made some mistake about this. Okay. That magistrate is to be elected for 4 years and is to be re-eligible as often as the people of the United States shall think him worthy of their confidence. That because Hamilton did not believe that there should be term limits. In these circumstances, there is a total dissimilitude between him, the president, and a king of Great Britain, who is a hereditary monarch, possessing the crown as a patrimony descendable to his heirs forever. But there is a close analogy between him, the president, and a governor of New York, who is elected for 3 years and is re-eligible without limitation or intermission. If we consider how much less time would be requisite for establishing a dangerous influence in a single state than for establishing a like influence throughout the United States, we must conclude that a duration of 4 years for the Chief Magistrate of the Union is a degree of permanency far less to be dreaded in that office than a duration of 3 years for a corresponding office in a single state. So going off of that quote, it seems that at least Hamilton's reasoning, or his summary of the reasoning which has occurred in the chamber, it is by mere analogy to the fact that it is a confederation of states. The states individually have incidentally had certain standards of offices like 3 and 4 years. So the president of the confederation of those states shall serve a like term a slightly longer term because of the greater complexity of managing over that confederation. Let's see, there's a bit more text here on that question. That's the President of the United States would be an officer elected by the people for 4 years. Conversely, the King of Great Britain is a perpetual and hereditary prince, right? So they mostly devise a number that's comfortable. Alexander Hamilton is fine with the president serving for the rest of his life. He ultimately fails even to influence George Washington personally to run more than twice. So he does not reach that ambition, but he does want the people across all the states, particularly the representative parties of those states, to be confident enough in the composition of the Constitution to ratify it and pass it. Compared to the Articles of Confederation that preceded it, which was considered relatively too weak to be functional, where there is not a single executive in the fashion there is, they wanted to be very careful to make it clear to the public that this sole executive is not the crown as a legal concept. And so they have to decide on a term of years, even if that's perpetually re-eligible. And I guess if you have a specific political ambition, if you say, I want these states to pass this ratification, and this is on the question of term limits of the president, you'd say they elect their governors of their respective states individually for periods of 3 to 4 years. So this is a notion that will be comfortable to them. I don't think much more thought went into it than that. The 18th century process, they used what they called pure reason, which actually is not even how we think of the notion of reason anymore. It relates more to notions like Hermetic occultism and things, which ended up being responsible for some of the innovations of early Enlightenment period science. Yeah, there's not a satisfying political answer for why the U.S. Constitution chose 4 years. It's basically just that. It was an expedient of the political era of the 1780s. But it has seemed to work fairly reliably, at least until recently. So it seems to be a recommendable term, but that's as much as I can say on that question.
Okay, thank you so much for your response. Lastly, I would like allow you to give your closing statement or closing presentations before we end this meeting.
Sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
Can you give the short conclusion regarding this topic today?
Yes, I can. So, in drawing together a conclusion, what I would essentially say is we are, at this moment in history, both you in Indonesia and myself and my countrymen in the United States, at the precipice of this post-colonial era in which a thread of conflict and a thread of collective creation of civilization between Christendom in Byzantium and the Holy Roman Empire and even the Dar al-Islam and the influences of the Hinduism, the Austronesians, the entire body of oceanic movement throughout the colonial period spreads this notion of Roman Republic all over the world. And it's a collective project between Christendom and Islam and Hinduism, because there isn't an aspect of even Christian scholarship, which is not the direct result of the influences of other people of other faiths around the world, particularly the great scholars of medieval Islam, who created the traditions which would lead the authors of Europe towards this Enlightenment era republic. And it's a little difficult to think about, given that the people who created these systems depended on the notion of every citizen, that being a very specific category of person, of a patrician, a paterfamilias, a head of a household, an independent person in terms of his material comforts and needs, a person essentially who may only participate in the state by having no needs of the state. This has a very destructive influence on the rest of the globe, but that influence has been to leave it with its legacy of republic. And here we are in what seems to be a state of internecine and endless geopolitical conflict and violence. And my own republic is not lacking in complicity, not lacking in involvement in much of this conflict. So the example of my republic at least in terms of the defense and the continued operation of a strong central civic state, does seem to recommend that presidential term limits, whether they are done by custom, by the common belief in civic virtues and civic republicanism of an ancient model, or by a formal restriction, it is at least solidifying of the ability of that state to function, and as well as creating the common demonstration of peaceful and stable transitions of power to new administrations. It has at least had that benefit. Now that benefit has been used for good and ill, depending on your various political views and various historical situations, various political contexts right now. But it is interesting, as these threads break down, as we start to wonder, should we amend our constitution? Should we think fundamentally differently about our republics because now we're frightened that President Trump has violated civic norms, or that there is such an impulse as to amend the Constitution to create more lax or an absence of term limit. That document, which is ostensibly your Constitution, is not so regimented and certain a thing as it tends to seem with all its legal authority, as states like us to think about the legitimacy of their institutions. Now, it's important for a functioning society that the people believe in the legitimacy of its institutions. And yet at the same time, that republic, which is listed on the document, is a cognitively unique instantiation of the notion of that state in every citizen. And without public confidence in the institutions, in the cognitive instantiation, the cognitive construct, the idea in one person's mind, any one person's mind, that this republic is a good idea, that if things as likely as a human being who happens to be serving as president dying will have such an effect on the continuance of a government and of a state, that we should not give them a term limit instead, so as to see what would happen to that transition while something can still be done about it, versus keeping them in office for the rest of their life and just seeing what will happen at the moment they die and their influence is no longer available, does not seem to be stabilizing or preferable, at least in my conception of history, my awareness of past events and narratives, and seeing the way governments have been destabilizing throughout the 20th century. And it does seem to be an intentional act of colonial and imperial statecraft that, although they created many presidential republics, among other states, depending on the individual situation, they did so with destabilizing factors. Because they, in the British Empire in particular, as well as the French Empire, they believed that they would still be around, still be so involved in international foreign policy, in imperial management, that they would be able to take advantage of those intrinsic instabilities, such as creating a presidential republic with a minority ethnicity in power or something like that. And when those imperial responsibilities, as a result of the events of World War II, transition sort of to this American republic, that is not necessarily in on those previous plans, is not necessarily doing the maintenance, the upkeep, to make sure that these former colonial ways of thinking about these states are still happening, which could be a good thing. Although it is a form of neglect, it is at least not direct settler colonialism, imperialism, but it does seem to play out in the fact that, especially in the Middle Eastern Arab republics that we left in the wake of the First World War, that the extension of presidential tenure is the first sign in the decay of a state, or if not the first, a very significant one. Somebody asked about the question of Russia. It's a good one too. It's when you start having political figures whose single personality is more prescient, more real to people, that their confidence in that person is more real to them than their confidence in the structure of the republic itself. That's when things start to degrade, both logistically in the efficacy of those policies, and in the character even of the person in that office, the person who, by their good qualities and virtues, perhaps, that led them to that office of the presidency. When they are allowed to stagnate, when they're allowed to lose their perspective and hold the office for that long, it seems to drive them down the wrong path. It seems to make their policies worse. It seems to bring corruption to their friendships merely because they're let to endure for longer than seems natural. People need a refreshment of ideas every so often. And the only real surety any state has is in its ability to relate to the cognitive environments of people. Every individual mind is an epistemic, unique instantiation of a reasoning person. And an entire republic of people who are against the notion of republic cannot sustain a republic, regardless of what's written in its constitution. So so far as having a republican state after this model, as opposed to not having one, it seems to be the case that presidential republics benefit from term limits, and that corruption breeds where they're absent. But of course, that's only admissible as the example of history is, and perhaps future examples will run against that. But that is offering only the counsel of that which had transpired before me and of which I have read. That is my recommendation. That if you are going to have in your next round of amendments a presidential republic, still, it is intrinsic in the nature of the structure of a presidential republic that sole executive, their power being a risk that they took in the creation of that office, against the example of a king, is necessary, at least in the conception of people who have presidential republics, for it to run, but not to run too far or too long, because that power is very great. In fact, it is a weight that must eventually be put down. And otherwise, the character of the president starts to become the character of Sisyphus, the one whose role to push up that burden never ends. Yeah, I suppose that's the end of that thought.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your thought and your insight regarding the presidential term under the American Constitution. I think that's all. We very happy to hear your perspective and also your knowledge. Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Yes, thank you very much. It's
Manas,
been an
Haika
honor to be on
boleh
here.
diberhentiin? Ya,